When the Henry County Courthouse burned in 1865, most assumed the flames consumed nothing but Confederate records and debt ledgers. But among the ashes, courthouse clerk Josiah Patton wrote in his private diary, "Workers found a locked iron chest containing 23 pages of testimony so disturbing that the Reconstruction authorities ordered every copy destroyed." The testimony belonged to a woman identified only as the Silent Giant, a slave woman who stood 6 feet 7 inches tall and for 18 years had not spoken a single word. Her silence ended on March 14, 1863, when a Union surgeon examined her in a contraband camp outside Richmond. What she whispered to him about her master and her 9 daughters caused 3 witnesses to vomit, and rather than document what he had heard, the surgeon himself requested immediate transfer to frontline duty. Her account was suppressed by the military. The surgeon died of typhoid 6 weeks later, and from all official records, the woman vanished, but fragments of her story survived in private letters, hidden journals, and the nightmares of those who heard it. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called Big Sarah and the plantation that consumed her children, we want to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state you are listening from. Now, let us enter the world of Greenbrier Plantation, where silence became the only mercy left. The woman who would become known as Big Sarah arrived at Greenbrier Plantation in Powhatan County, Virginia on an August morning in 1831. That same week, 70 miles to the southeast, Nat Turner began his rebellion. On 2,000 acres of tobacco land along the James River sat Greenbrier, far enough from Richmond to feel isolated, but close enough that its owner, Nathaniel Crowther, could maintain business connections with the city's merchant class. The plantation house itself was an imposing 3-story structure of red brick with white columns that Crowther had installed in 1828 to match the Greek Revival fashion sweeping through Virginia's planter elite. A neat row behind the main house was formed by 12 slave cabins. Each structure housed between 6 and 10 people in conditions that even by the standards of 1831 were recognized as harsh. From his father in 1824, Crowther had inherited Greenbrier, along with debts that had nearly destroyed the family name. At 31, he had managed to restore some of the plantation's profitability through tobacco cultivation and what he called strategic breeding programs, a practice that was becoming increasingly common as the domestic slave trade expanded and the overseas trade had been officially abolished since 1808. His wife Constance had died in childbirth in 1829, leaving him with no legitimate children, but a plantation to run and a reputation to rebuild among the Tidewater aristocracy. Stepping off the wagon that August morning, the woman was unlike any slave the other captives at Greenbrier had ever seen. Well over 6 foot tall she stood, with broad shoulders and hands so large they could palm a man's head like a melon. The slave trader who brought her, a man named Vernon Caldwell from Charleston, claimed she was 22 years old and had been born on a rice plantation in the South Carolina Low Country. He sold her to Crowther for $800, a significant sum that reflected both her size and what Caldwell described as her exceptional breeding potential. Her name, Caldwell said, was Sarah. From a previous owner's estate, she had been separated after what Caldwell vaguely described as an incident of defiance. When Crowther asked what kind of defiance, Caldwell's expression hardened. He said only that Sarah had watched something happen to her mother, and since that day, not a single word had she spoken to anyone, white or black. Her teeth, her hands, her legs, Crowther examined them all. Back and forth, he had her walk. With a strange mechanical quality she moved, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, never meeting anyone's gaze. Her silence did not trouble Crowther. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. What Crowther did not tell Caldwell or anyone else was that for exactly this kind of woman, he had been looking. In the months since his wife's death, increasingly obsessed had Crowther become with what he called improving the stock of his slave population. In a leather journal, he kept detailed records documenting heights, weights, physical characteristics, and what he termed reproductive capacity. Treatises on animal husbandry he had read and had begun to apply those same principles to human beings. With the certainty of a man who had never been challenged, he believed that he could breed a generation of slaves who would be stronger, more obedient, and more valuable than any that had come before. In his mind, Sarah was the perfect foundation for this experiment. Her height and strength meant her children would likely inherit those traits. Her silence meant she would not corrupt them with stories of freedom or resistance. And her apparent brokenness, the blank expression, the mechanical movements, suggested a spirit that had already been crushed, which meant she would not fight what was to come. With a mixture of curiosity and pity, the other slaves at Greenbrier watched Sarah's arrival. An older woman named Bess, who served as the unofficial matriarch of the slave quarters, later told another captive that she knew immediately something was wrong with Sarah. Not wrong in her mind, Bess would explain, but wrong in her soul. That look she had seen before on people who had witnessed things so terrible that words could no longer contain them. In those cases, silence was not a weakness, but a fortress, the last defense against a world that had already taken everything else. Initially, Crowther assigned Sarah to fieldwork, but within 2 weeks he had relocated her to a separate cabin, a small structure that had previously been used for storage, set apart from the other slave quarters. He told the overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Stanton, that Sarah required special management and that she was not to be worked in the same crews as the other slaves. Stanton, who had been with Crowther for 3 years and had learned not to question his employer's stranger instructions, simply nodded and made the arrangements. On the night of a new moon that September, Crowther visited Sarah's cabin for the first time. With him, he carried a lantern, a bottle of whiskey, and a leather strap. When he emerged 2 hours later, his shirt was torn, and his knuckles were bleeding, but his expression was one of satisfaction. He told Stanton the next morning that Sarah had accepted her new role and that from now on, she was to be left entirely to his supervision. No other white man was to enter her cabin. No other slave was to speak to her unless given explicit permission. During the day, she would work in the fields, but her nights belonged to Crowther alone. What this meant, the other slaves knew. They had seen it happen before, though never with such calculated deliberation. Bess tried once to approach Sarah during the lunch break in the fields to offer some word of comfort or solidarity, but Sarah simply stared through her as if she were made of glass. Absolute was her silence. When Bess touched her arm, Sarah flinched so violently that she dropped her water gourd, but not a sound did she make, not a gasp, not a cry, nothing. By December of 1831, the first signs of Sarah's pregnancy became visible. With evident satisfaction, Crowther recorded the date in his journal, noting her measurements and estimating that the child would be born in late spring. He began to feed her better than the other slaves, more meat, more vegetables, milk from the plantation's dairy. He wanted to ensure, he told Stanton, that the child would be healthy and strong. For this child and for all the children that would follow, he had plans. As Sarah's belly grew through the winter months, the other slaves watched. They saw how Crowther visited her cabin every few nights. How he sometimes brought cloth or small gifts that he presented to her as if she were a prized mare in his stable. They saw how Sarah's silence deepened. How she moved through the world like a ghost in a body too large to hide. When they could, some of the women tried to help her, leaving extra food near her cabin, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement when they passed in the fields, but Sarah never responded. Her eyes remained fixed on that distant, unreachable point, and her lips stayed sealed as if they had been sewn shut. Bess would later tell her granddaughter that she could feel something dark gathering over Greenbrier that winter. The air felt heavier than it should, she said. And the area around Sarah's cabin, birds seemed to avoid. In the traditional sense, Bess did not believe in curses or haunts, but she believed in evil, the humankind that needed no supernatural explanation. And she believed that Nathaniel Crowther was bringing something terrible into being, something that would not be satisfied until it had consumed everything in its path. During a thunderstorm so violent that the oldest slaves claimed it was the worst they had seen in 20 years, Sarah's first child was born on May 3, 1832. The midwife, a skilled woman named Patience who had delivered hundreds of babies on various plantations, later told Bess that the birth itself was unremarkable. The baby was large and healthy, a girl with her mother's height already evident in her long limbs. What disturbed Patience was Sarah's complete silence throughout the labor. Most women screamed, cried, cursed, or prayed. Sarah made no sound at all. At the ceiling beams of her cabin, she stared, tears streaming down her face, but her mouth remained closed. When Patience placed the baby in her arms, Sarah looked at the child with an expression that Patience would describe years later as the saddest thing I ever witnessed, ever. It was not the sadness of exhaustion or pain, but something deeper, a grief that seemed to know the future. Crowther named the child Delilah and recorded her birth in his journal with meticulous detail, 8 pounds, 3 ounces, 22 in long. Perfect specimens, he wrote. Both mother and daughter. The next day, he visited the cabin with a small silver rattle, an object that seemed grotesquely out of place in the sparse dirt-floored room. In the baby's hand, he placed it and smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose investment was paying dividends. With those empty eyes, Sarah watched him, holding her daughter close and saying nothing. For the first year of Delilah's life, Sarah was allowed to keep the child with her. Crowther believed, based on his readings about animal breeding, that the mother's milk and care in the early months would strengthen the child's constitution. He continued to visit Sarah's cabin regularly, and by the time Delilah turned 8 months old, Sarah was pregnant again. The pattern had been established. Crowther had no intention of stopping. The second child, Rebecca, was born in March of 1833. The third, Judith, arrived in November of that same year. The fourth, Ruth, came in July of 1834. Each pregnancy followed the same ritual: Crowther's visits, Sarah's silence, the birth attended by patience, and the careful documentation in Crowther's journal. Each time, Sarah held her newborn daughter with that same expression of unbearable sadness, and each time, she remained silent. The full scope of Crowther's design began to be understood by the other slaves. He was not simply taking Sarah as a concubine, as many slaveholders did. He was systematically breeding her, treating her as livestock with the explicit goal of producing as many children as possible. And every single child was a girl. This was not by chance, the older slaves whispered, but by design. Daughters were what Crowther wanted because daughters could be bred in turn. Generations ahead he was planning, building what he called his improved line. By 1836, Sarah had given birth to 6 daughters: Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi. All of them showed signs of their mother's unusual height. Delilah, at 4 years old, was already as tall as a typical 6-year-old. Crowther was delighted. He had begun to separate the older girls from their mother, assigning them to work in the main house where he could observe their development more closely. He told Stanton that he wanted them to learn domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, sewing, so that they would be more valuable when the time came. But those who worked in the house saw how Crowther watched these little girls, how his eyes followed them with the same calculating assessment he had once directed at their mother. The female house slaves began to fear what would happen when these girls reached adolescence. Less and less did Sarah see her daughters as they grew older. Crowther had decided that limiting contact between mother and children would prevent Sarah from teaching them any ideas about resistance or escape. He wanted the daughters to see their situation as natural, inevitable. He wanted them compliant and ignorant like their mother appeared to be. What Crowther did not understand, what his arrogance prevented him from seeing, was that Sarah's silence was not compliance. It was calculation. In late 1836, 2 events occurred that would set in motion the tragedy that still haunts Powhatan County. The first was that Crowther hired a new overseer. Virgil Stanton had died in August of that year, kicked in the head by a mule in what everyone agreed was a fitting end for a cruel man. His replacement was a younger man named Edmund Yancey, recently arrived from North Carolina. Yancey was efficient and brutal, but unlike Stanton, he was also curious. He noticed things. He kept his own records, and he began to wonder about the tall, silent woman in the isolated cabin and the growing number of light-skinned girls who all bore a striking resemblance to their master. The second event was that Sarah became pregnant for the 7th time. But this pregnancy was different from the others. By the end of her second trimester, it became clear that she was carrying twins. Examining her in the cabin, patients felt 2 distinct heads and told Crowther that by spring, he could expect 2 more daughters. Crowther's excitement was almost childish. Twins meant his breeding program was even more successful than he had hoped. He doubled Sarah's food rations and forbade her from any field work. She was too valuable now to risk. The twins, Hannah and Abigail, were born on March 22, 1837. Both survived. Both were healthy, and both were girls. From Sarah, Crowther now had 8 daughters, ranging in age from 5-year-old Delilah to newborns Hannah and Abigail. In his journal, he calculated that if the pattern continued, Sarah could produce at least 6 more children before her childbearing years ended. For Delilah's future, he had already begun to plan. She would turn 12 in 1839. By 13 or 14, she could begin bearing children herself. The cycle would continue, expanding exponentially, creating a dynasty of slaves who would make Greenbrier the most prosperous plantation in Powhatan County. But after the twins were born, something had changed in Sarah. Patients noticed it first. Sarah had always been silent, but now there was something different in her eyes, not emptiness, but intensity. With an expression that was no longer simply sad, she watched her newborn daughters. It was focused, determined. For the first time in 6 years, patients saw Sarah's jaw clench with what looked like rage. On a cold night in November of 1837, 6 months after the twins' birth, screams erupted from the main house. The slaves in the quarters heard Crowther shouting, then the sound of something heavy crashing. From his cabin with a pistol, Yancey emerged and ran toward the house. What he found inside would become the subject of whispered speculation for decades to come, though the official record would say almost nothing about it. Cowering in a corner of Crowther's study was 5-year-old Delilah, her dress torn. Crowther himself was bleeding from a wound on his head caused by a brass candlestick that lay on the floor. And standing in the doorway, silent as always, but with her massive frame blocking any exit, was Sarah. In her hand, she held a kitchen knife. Somehow, she had left her locked cabin, made her way to the main house, and found her daughter in Crowther's study. What exactly she had witnessed was never officially recorded, but the implications were clear to everyone present. Yancey raised his pistol, aiming at Sarah's chest. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sarah did something extraordinary. For the first time since her arrival at Greenbrier 6 years earlier, she looked directly at Crowther. She looked at him with an expression of such profound hatred that Yancey later told his wife it made his blood run cold. And then, still holding the knife, she turned and walked out of the house. She did not run. She simply walked with that same mechanical gait back toward her cabin. Wiping blood from his face, Crowther screamed at Yancey to shoot her. But Yancey hesitated. Something in Sarah's deliberate, calm departure had unnerved him. She was not fleeing like someone who feared punishment. She was withdrawing like someone who had accomplished exactly what she intended. Before Yancey could make a decision, Sarah had disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, they found her sitting in her cabin with her 9th daughter, a newborn she had delivered by herself during the night. No one had even known she was pregnant again. The baby, whom Crowther would name Miriam, was small but alive. Holding her, Sarah sat, dried blood on her thighs, the kitchen knife placed deliberately on the floor in front of her. She stared straight ahead, silent as always, waiting for whatever would come next. With a dilemma, Crowther was faced. By law and custom, Sarah's attack on a white man, even in defense of her daughter, was a capital offense. He could have her hanged or sold away. But doing so would mean losing his breeding program, his improved line, and the fortune he believed these children represented. After a week of deliberation, he made his decision. Sarah would be punished, but not killed. She would be locked in her cabin permanently, let out only for necessary physical maintenance. She would no longer see her daughters at all. And to ensure she could never attack anyone again, Crowther had a blacksmith forge an iron collar that would remain around her neck permanently, attached to a chain bolted to the wall of her cabin. The chain was long enough that she could move around the small space, but not long enough to reach the door. In horror, the other slaves watched as this sentence was carried out. Bess wept openly, which earned her 10 lashes from Yancey. The house slaves who had cared for Sarah's daughters were forbidden from speaking about what had happened. And Edmund Yancey, who had seen something in that moment in Crowther's study that he could not quite articulate, began to keep a secret journal of his own, a record of observations that would prove crucial years later. In December of 1837, Sarah's punishment began. For the next 4 years, she lived in that cabin, chained like an animal, visited only by Crowther for his purposes and by patients when births required medical attention. In that first year of captivity, she gave birth to her 9th daughter. She never saw Delilah again. She never held Rebecca or Judith or any of her other children. And she never, ever spoke. But silence, as Bess had understood years earlier, can be a weapon, and with every passing day, Sarah was sharpening hers. The years between 1837 and 1845 transformed Greenbrier Plantation into something that even neighboring slaveholders found disturbing. Crowther's obsession with his breeding program had evolved into a mania that consumed his every waking thought. He had converted 2 rooms of the main house into what he called his study of human husbandry, filling them with charts, measurements, and daguerreotype images of Sarah's daughters at various ages. He corresponded with agricultural societies and even some medical professionals, though he was careful to phrase his inquiries in abstract terms that did not reveal the full scope of his experiments. In their separate spheres, the daughters themselves grew, each one developing under Crowther's watchful eye. Delilah, the eldest, turned 13 in 1845. She had inherited her mother's height and was nearly 6 feet tall with the kind of striking appearance that drew attention wherever she went. Crowther had trained her in household management and had begun introducing her to visitors as his ward, a fiction that fooled no one but satisfied his need for social respectability. What happened in the private hours between Crowther and Delilah was known only to the house slaves who changed the sheets and heard the sounds that echoed through the corridors at night. Rebecca, Judith, and Ruth worked in the house as well, learning skills that Crowther claimed would make them valuable as skilled slaves. Esther and Naomi, slightly younger, helped in the kitchen under the supervision of the cook, an elderly woman named Dinah, who treated the girls with a gentleness that bordered on defiance. The youngest three, Hannah, Abigail, and Miriam, still lived in the slave quarters, though Crowther had them brought to the main house regularly for what he called inspections. Throughout these years, Sarah remained chained in her cabin. The other slaves rarely saw her. Crowther had the cabin's windows boarded up from the outside, supposedly to prevent her from signaling to others, but the real reason seemed to be that he wanted her existence erased from view. Food was left at her door twice a day. Once a week, she was allowed outside, still chained, to walk in a small fenced area behind her cabin. During these brief moments of semi-freedom, the other slaves would sometimes catch glimpses of her. They reported that she had changed. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her body, though still massive, had taken on a gauntness that suggested inadequate nutrition despite Crowther's claims of proper care. But her eyes, those who dared to look into them said her eyes had become something else entirely, not empty anymore, but burning. During these years, Edmund Yancey continued to keep his secret journal, documenting observations that troubled him increasingly. He noted the ages of the daughters and the timing of when Crowther's nocturnal visits to their rooms began. He recorded the tears he saw on Delilah's face at breakfast the morning after her 13th birthday, and the way Rebecca flinched when Crowther touched her shoulder when she turned 12. Yancey was no abolitionist. He believed in slavery and enforced it brutally. But he found himself repulsed by what he was witnessing. There was slavery, and then there was this. Even he could see the difference. In September of 1845, a Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Sheffield visited Greenbrier as part of his rounds through Powhatan County. Crowther was not a particularly religious man, but he maintained appearances for social standing, and he allowed Sheffield to preach to the slaves on Sunday afternoons. Sheffield was a thin, intense man in his 40s, genuinely committed to spreading the gospel, even to those in bondage. Unlike many white preachers of the era, he actually seemed to care about the spiritual welfare of enslaved people, though his understanding of justice was limited by the blinders of his time and place. During his visit, Sheffield noticed the unusual number of mixed-race girls at Greenbrier, all bearing a striking resemblance to each other. He commented on this to Crowther, who explained with barely concealed pride that these were the daughters of a particular slave woman who possessed exceptional breeding qualities. Sheffield's expression darkened. He asked if he might speak with this woman to provide spiritual counsel. Crowther refused, claiming she was unwell and could not receive visitors. Something in his refusal made Sheffield suspicious. That evening, Sheffield spoke quietly with some of the older slaves, including Bess. What she told him carefully, knowing the danger of speaking too freely to any white men, horrified him. She did not mention Crowther's sexual violence explicitly. But she spoke of Sarah's chains, her isolation, and the sorrow that hung over the plantation like a fog. She mentioned that Sarah had not spoken in 14 years, that she had been separated from her 9 daughters, that she lived in darkness. Enough did Sheffield understand to grasp the full picture. The next morning, before leaving Greenbrier, Sheffield confronted Crowther directly. It was a brave act, possibly foolish, for a circuit preacher with no wealth or power. He told Crowther that what he was doing was an abomination before God, that no amount of property rights could justify such treatment of a human being, that even within the institution of slavery, there were lines that should not be crossed. With an expression of cold amusement, Crowther listened, then informed Sheffield that he was no longer welcome at Greenbrier. If Sheffield made any public accusations, Crowther warned he would sue him for defamation and use his considerable influence to have Sheffield removed from the Methodist ministry. Shaken and angry, Sheffield left, but ultimately powerless. However, Sheffield did something that would prove significant later. He wrote a detailed letter to his bishop describing what he had witnessed at Greenbrier without naming Crowther directly. He also sent a copy to a fellow minister in Richmond who had expressed sympathy with the more reform-minded elements of the Methodist Church. These letters would sit in church archives, forgotten, until the Civil War brought them back to light. In December of 1845, something changed in Sarah's cabin. Patients, who still attended to Sarah's medical needs, noticed it. During a routine visit, Sarah had begun scratching marks on the walls, lines arranged in groups of 5 like a prisoner counting days. But these marks did not seem to be counting time linearly. Instead, they were arranged in 9 columns, each column containing a different number of marks. When patients looked more closely, she realized with a chill that each column corresponded to one of Sarah's daughters. Sarah was tracking them, tracking their ages, counting. Patients said nothing to Crowther about this discovery. But that night, lying in her own bed in the slave quarters, she found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about those marks on the wall, the methodical precision of them, the organization. Sarah had not spoken in 14 years, but in her mind, she was not silent. She was remembering. She was planning. And somehow patients knew that whatever Sarah was planning would be terrible. The spring of 1846 brought changes to Greenbrier that would accelerate the coming disaster. Crowther, now 53 years old and increasingly confident in his breeding program's success, decided to expand his operations. He purchased 3 more slave women, specifically selected for their height and physical strength, intending to replicate his success with Sarah. He also constructed 3 new cabins near Sarah's, each designed with the same isolation features, boarded windows, reinforced doors, and iron rings embedded in the floor for chains. With growing dread, the other slaves watched these preparations. They understood what Crowther intended, and they knew that Sarah's fate would be replicated 3 times over. But in his confidence, Crowther had become sloppy. He spent more time in Richmond, socializing with other planters, and even presenting a paper to an agricultural society about improved breeding techniques for the labor force, a paper that was abstract enough to be respectable, but specific enough that some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. During his absences, the day-to-day management of Greenbrier fell increasingly to Edmund Yancey, whose private disgust with Crowther's methods had matured into something resembling a crisis of conscience. Yancey had never considered himself a moral man. He had whipped slaves, separated families, and enforced the brutal discipline that kept the plantation running. But Crowther's systematic sexual exploitation of Sarah and his daughters crossed a line that even Yancey found intolerable. It was not that Yancey believed slavery was wrong. He did not. But he believed that even within that evil institution, there were rules, boundaries, traditions that separated civilization from savagery. In pursuit of his obsession, Crowther had abandoned all of that. In April of 1846, Yancey did something that would have gotten him killed if Crowther had discovered it. He unlocked Sarah's cabin door one afternoon while Crowther was in Richmond and stood at the threshold, not entering, but looking inside. On her straw mattress, Sarah sat, the iron collar around her neck, the chain stretching to the wall. She looked at him with those burning eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Yancey spoke. He said, "I know what he has done to you. I know what he is doing to your daughters. I cannot stop him. But I want you to know that someone sees it. Someone knows." Sarah stared at him, her expression unchanging. Then slowly she raised her hand and pointed toward the wall where she had scratched her marks, the 9 columns representing her 9 daughters. At those marks, Yancey looked and understood. She was not asking for sympathy. She was making sure he knew she was counting. Making sure someone would remember when the time came how many there were, how many had been violated, how many had been stolen from her. Yancey nodded, locked the door, and walked away feeling like he had just witnessed something that would haunt him until his death. That summer, Delilah became pregnant. She was 14 years old. The father was obviously Crowther, though he never acknowledged this publicly. With a mixture of pity and horror, the house slaves watched her belly grow, understanding that Crowther's plan had entered its next phase. He was breeding the 2nd generation now. His improved line was expanding exactly as he had designed it. When Dinah, the elderly cook, tried to comfort Delilah one evening in the kitchen, the girl broke down sobbing. She whispered through her tears that she wanted to die, that she had tried to throw herself down the stairs, but Rebecca had stopped her, that she could not bear what was happening to her. Dinah held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. There were no words adequate to this particular kind of suffering. In September, something extraordinary happened. A slave named Josiah, who worked in the stables, was making repairs to Sarah's cabin when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a voice, low, rough from disuse, but unmistakably human. Sarah was speaking, not to him, not to anyone present, but to herself. She was reciting names. Delilah, Rebecca, Judith, Ruth, Esther, Naomi, Hannah, Abigail, Miriam, over and over, like a prayer or an incantation. Josiah finished his repairs quickly and left without saying anything, but he told Bess what he had heard. Bess's blood ran cold. For 15 years, Sarah had been silent, and now she was speaking again, speaking her daughter's names in the darkness of her prison. It felt like something was awakening, something that had been waiting a very long time. October brought tragedy and revelation in equal measure. Rebecca, who was 12 years old, tried to run away. She made it 15 miles before slave catchers found her hiding in a barn. They brought her back to Greenbrier in chains, and Crowther had her whipped in front of all the other slaves as an example. 20 lashes methodically applied by Yancey, who later wrote in his journal that it was the worst thing he had ever done. Through the first 10 lashes, Rebecca screamed, then for the last 10, she went silent, her mind retreating to wherever people go when the body can no longer protect them. When it was over, Crowther announced that Rebecca would be sold away within the week. He had decided she was a bad influence on her sisters. This announcement caused something unexpected to happen. Delilah, her belly now visibly swollen with Crowther's child, stepped forward and spoke in front of everyone. She said, "You cannot sell her. She is my sister. If you sell her, I will tell everyone in Richmond what you have done to us. I will stand on a street corner and tell everyone who will listen." The slaves held their breath. No one spoke to Crowther this way, certainly no slave, and especially not a pregnant 14-year-old girl. Crowther's face turned purple with rage. He stepped toward Delilah, raising his hand to strike her, but then he stopped. He looked at her pregnant belly, his investment, his future profits, and lowered his hand. Through gritted teeth, he said that Rebecca would not be sold, but she would spend the next month in the root cellar beneath the kitchen with minimal food and water to contemplate her sins. A small victory had Delilah won, but everyone present understood it would not be forgotten. That night, Yancey broke his own rules again. He went to Sarah's cabin and, speaking through the door, told her what had happened with Delilah and Rebecca. He told her that Delilah was pregnant. He told her that Rebecca had tried to escape. He did not know why he felt compelled to do this. Perhaps because Sarah had no other way of knowing what was happening to her daughters. Perhaps because he felt she had a right to know. Or perhaps because he needed someone to understand the full scope of what was unfolding. When he finished speaking, there was silence. Then from inside the cabin, he heard Sarah's voice for the first time. It was deeper than he expected, roughened by years of disuse. She said only 3 words. "They are mine." Ice ran down Yancey's spine. He understood that Sarah was not speaking of possession but of identity. Those girls were hers. They came from her body. And what was happening to them was happening to her. He walked away from the cabin feeling certain that something terrible was building, some storm that had been gathering for 15 years, and that when it finally broke, it would destroy everything in its path. November of 1846 marked 15 years since Sarah's arrival at Greenbrier. During those 15 years, she had given birth to 9 daughters. She had been raped hundreds of times. She had been chained like an animal for 9 years. She had watched her eldest daughter follow her into the same nightmare. And through all of it, she had maintained her silence, not from compliance or defeat, but from something else entirely, something patient, something that knew how to wait. Just when we thought we understood the full horror of what was happening at Greenbrier, the situation intensifies in ways that will shock even those familiar with the darkest chapters of American history. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens when Sarah's silence finally breaks. On December 1, 1846, Delilah gave birth to a son. It was the first male child born from Crowther's breeding program, and his excitement was almost manic. He named the boy Nathaniel Jr. and announced to the house slaves that this child represented the future of Greenbrier. A son meant continuity, legitimacy in his twisted mind. He could claim the boy as his heir, though everyone knew the truth about his parentage. What Crowther did not anticipate was Delilah's reaction to her son. The moment she held the infant, something shifted in her. The house slave saw it, a hardening around her eyes, a straightening of her spine despite her exhaustion. She looked at this baby boy born from violence and exploitation and made a decision that would echo through the coming months. She refused to nurse him. When Crowther demanded she feed the child, she turned her face to the wall and said nothing. They brought in a wet nurse, another enslaved woman named Flora. But Delilah's rejection of her own son created a tension in the household that everyone could feel. Yancey noted in his journal that Delilah seemed to be following her mother's example of strategic silence. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, moved through the house like a shadow, and kept her eyes down except when she thought no one was watching. In those unguarded moments, Yancey caught expressions on her face that reminded him disturbingly of Sarah. That same burning intensity, that same sense of someone counting, calculating, waiting. The winter of 1847 was brutal. Snow fell early and stayed late, trapping everyone at Greenbrier for weeks at a time. The isolation seemed to amplify the darkness that had settled over the plantation. Crowther spent more time in the main house, drinking heavily, obsessively checking on his daughters and documenting their development in his journals. He had begun to turn his attention to 13-year-old Judith, and the house slaves knew what that meant. The cycle was continuing, expanding, consuming. In February, something happened that would prove to be a turning point. Rebecca, who had spent her month in the root cellar the previous fall and emerged changed, quieter, harder, was caught teaching some of the younger slaves to read using a stolen Bible. Literacy among slaves was illegal in Virginia, and teaching reading was considered a dangerous subversion. Crowther was furious. He had Rebecca whipped again, 10 lashes this time. But even through the punishment, she remained silent. When it was over, she looked at Crowther with an expression of such pure contempt that he actually stepped backward. That night, Yancey made his most dangerous decision yet. He went to Sarah's cabin with a lantern and unlocked the door. He stepped inside for the first time since her imprisonment began 9 years earlier. The smell was overwhelming: unwashed body, waste, despair. In the corner, Sarah sat, the chain attached to her iron collar, her gray hair hanging in matted clumps. But when she raised her eyes to look at him, Yancey saw intelligence there, focus, purpose. He told her everything. He told her about Delilah's baby, about Rebecca's whipping, about Judith's future. He told her that Crowther planned to start breeding the younger daughters as soon as they reached puberty. He told her that the new cabins were ready for the 3 new women Crowther had purchased. He told her that the evil was expanding, multiplying, and that he did not know how to stop it, but felt she deserved to know. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice rough but clear. "How long until spring?" The question startled Yancey. He said it was February, so perhaps 2 months. Sarah nodded slowly. Then she asked, "Where do they keep the keys?" Yancey understood immediately what she was asking. The keys to all the chains.